Mr. President, this is a very important debate for the American people. We've got an economy that is struggling. We've got a lot of people who are hurting. And I think in the context of that debate, it's very important that we remember when we're spending these dollars that we're spending the American people's dollars. And yes, we want to be able to respond in a way to the economic crisis the country is experiencing that allows people to spend more money, that gets more money back into the hands of the American people, that will help grow the economy and create jobs, provide the necessary incentives for small businesses to invest. But I think it's really important at the outset of the debate that we give a serious consideration and thought to what we're doing here and what we're talking about in terms of the dimensions and the scale of what we are talking about. I'm not sure, Mr. President, that when we throw around numbers here in Washington, D.C., when we talk in millions, when we talk in billions, and in this case, $1 trillion, that we treat it like it's something abstract. And I think it's sometimes important to boil it down so that we remember that we put in perspective the dimension and the scale and the scope and the size of what is being talked about this week on the floor of the United States Senate. I want to put up a chart, Mr. President, that illustrates that very point. Because a lot of people, if you think about $1 trillion and you put them back to back, if you put a bunch of $100 bills back to back on top of each other, and you ask somebody around the country, how high would that stack go? I'm sure you'd get a lot of varying answers. You'd probably have some people who say, well, it might go 300 yards into the air. Some people might say, well, it might go 5 miles into the air. But the reality is, if you took $100 bills, Mr. President, and stacked them on top of each other, you would have a stack that goes 689 miles high. Back to back to back, and that's $100 bills. We're not talking about dollar bills. We are talking about $100.
Does Senator yield for a question on this point?
Madam, I would say through the chair, the senator from California just had an opportunity. I'd like to finish my remarks, and I'd be happy to yield for the question.
Thank you. I'll stay on the floor.
Mr. President, the point I'm making here is that you have to sometimes, I think, illustrate this in a very graphic, sometimes, way to help us understand what we're talking about here. And so I would make my point simply again. $100 bills stacked back to back to back, if you stacked them on top of each other, would equal 689 miles. Now, another way of looking at this is if you took $100 bills and wrapped them around the earth at the equator. In other words, you took $100 bills, not stacked them on top of each other, but wrapped them side by side all around the earth. If you can believe this, it would go around the earth almost 39 times. That's 969,000 miles, $100 bills that would go around the earth if you took $1 trillion and broke it down that way. That very simply, I think, puts into perspective what it is we're talking about. Now, somebody else has described it this way, but if you started spending $1 million a day on the day that Christ was born, and you spend $1 million every single day up until today, you still wouldn't have spent $1 trillion. That's the dimension of what we're talking about. Now, I remember when I was in business school, we had our little business analyst calculators that we used to do financial calculations. You couldn't even get to this. You couldn't even get to $1 trillion on calculators back at that time. I hope today, for purposes of doing economic calculations, because of the scale that we're talking about, that those calculators go that far. But my point, Mr. President, is this is an enormous amount of money. An enormous amount of money. We're talking about $1.26 trillion of our children and grandchildren's money over the next 10 years. And I think there's a basic principle that all members of the United States Senate should consider when we're spending our fellow citizens' hard-earned dollars. And that principle is this, Mr. President: we should not spend money we don't have on things that we don't need. Let me say it again. We should not spend money that we don't have on things that we don't need. Now, families and business owners understand this principle, but unfortunately, it's a principle that's been lost and escaped our colleagues on the other side who have drafted this 700-page trillion-dollar spending bill, which is filled with lots of government spending that I think most Americans would characterize as wasteful. I'm not saying that all government spending is bad. Government spending, if it's properly focused and highly scrutinized, may have some counter-cyclical impact. And one example of that would be infrastructure spending that we use to improve our roads and bridges or provide access to clean drinking water that can provide jobs in the short term, and it can create economic opportunity in the long term. The problem we have, Mr. President, this bill is laden with unfocused, unnecessary, and wasteful spending. Now, the stated goal of a stimulus proposal was stated by, I think, Larry Summers earlier this year, was that it should be timely, temporary, and targeted. I may not be saying those in the right order, but temporary, targeted, and timely. Basically, three criteria, three metrics by which we would measure a stimulus proposal, whether it's effective or not, whether it works. And I would argue that this particular bill is none of the above. It is slow, it is unfocused, and it is unending. It makes commitments way beyond the 1 year, 2 year window that we were talking about if we really want to have an impact and create jobs with stimulus. So even with a price tag that's greater than any previous stimulus package in the history of our country, the majority of the spending in this bill, Mr. President, is not focused on job creation and fails to meet the job creation goals that our President has called for, and I think that the American public expects. With record deficits in the near term, this bill as drafted is a mistake that I don't believe we can afford to make. According to the Congressional Budget Office, we have a $1.2 trillion deficit in fiscal year 2009 before any financial stabilization or stimulus measures are passed by this Congress. Now, again, we're going to spend $1 trillion on this, and I would point out what $1 trillion means. If you took dollar bills and you put them side by side, 969,000 miles, and that is the amount we're talking about spending. It's also the amount of the deficit in this particular fiscal year 2009, and that is before, as I said before, any financial stabilization or stimulus measures are passed by this Congress. And frankly, we expect other requests to come forward in the area of financial stabilization. Now, just to put the $1.2 trillion deficit into perspective, that's roughly triple the previous record of $455 billion that the deficit came to in fiscal year 2008. So it's important to note that we have already, this deficit in fiscal year 2009 will exceed by almost 3 times the deficit in the year 2008. It's going to be over $1 trillion before we do any of these other things. Now, it's also important to note, Mr. President, that Congress, not the executive branch, has the constitutional authority to raise and to spend revenue. That's the power of the purse by our Constitution falls to the Congress. And so if we're looking for a scapegoat in this whole fiscal imbalance, we need to look no further than the halls of Congress. In fact, in the last couple of years, the Democrats regained the Congress back in 2007. The federal deficits ballooned from $160 billion, or 1.2% of our gross domestic product, in 2007, to over $1 trillion, or 8.3% of our gross domestic product this year in fiscal year 2009. Now, if we include just the additional spending for this proposal before us, the 2009 projected deficit, and I'm talking about now stimulus and the deficit, as I mentioned earlier, that's already projected for 2009, it would increase to $1.43 trillion. Almost $1.5 trillion in deficits, or, put another way, about 10% of our gross domestic product. Now, I have to remind my colleagues, Mr. President, that we're still very early in the year. We have almost 9 months left in this fiscal year to spend even more of our children's and grandchildren's tax dollars. The Congress is soon going to consider an omnibus spending bill for the remainder of fiscal year 2009. We'll also have to consider a war supplemental bill and the potential of additional bailouts for the financial sector, which we're told that request may be coming as early as next week. Without a question, we're going to end 2009 in perhaps the worst financial condition that the nation has ever seen. In fact, Mr. President, the last time that we had a single-year deficit to GDP ratio over 8% was the year 1945 during the height of World War II. Now, just for comparative purposes, the European Union, the federal deficit there that we have this year of 10%, if you add the stimulus in, wouldn't even be good enough to get into the European Union. According to the European Union rules, member nations have to have a budget deficit of 3% or less. Our federal deficit this year will be 3 times higher than the maximum threshold to get into the European Union. Of course, European countries are also dealing with the same contractionary forces that we're dealing with in this country, which are driving up their collective deficit to GDP ratios to record highs. But even with those factors and influences in those economies, the Eurozone's collective deficits will only reach 4.7% in 2009. That's 4.7% of their gross domestic product, which will be less than half of the U.S.'s total. Now, when you talk about being faced with such unsustainable deficits, Congress, Mr. President, I would argue, has to carefully analyze any and all deficit spending. Any additional government program that's financed with more deficit spending needs to meet the highest standards of job creation and return on taxpayer investment. And unfortunately, the spending bill that we have before us contains a long list of government programs that fail to meet that standard. I could go down the list, and I won't go through the entire list because it would take too long, but $1 billion for the census, $20 million for the removal of small to medium-sized fish passage barriers, $400 million for STD prevention, $25 million to rehabilitate ATV or recreational vehicle trails, $34 million to remodel the Department of Commerce headquarters in Washington, D.C., $70 million to support supercomputing activities for climate research, $208 million for disconnected youth, $1.2 billion for summer employment, $246 million in a tax break for Hollywood filmmakers, $6 billion so that bureaucrats here in Washington can enjoy the benefits of green technology. Now, I happen to be one that supports green technology, and I think we ought to be moving in that direction. But we also have many of opportunities, energy bills that we debate on a regular basis around here, in order to engage in how we at best can be moving our country in a green direction. But, Mr. President, these programs don't create jobs, and they hardly justify a $1.2 trillion debt on the shoulders of our children and grandchildren. And so I would encourage my colleagues, as we go through the debate this week, to scrutinize every line item in this 700-page bill and ask themselves if these provisions will create jobs and justify making record deficits even worse. Mr. President, we shouldn't spend money we don't have on things we don't need. Over the next few days, several amendments are going to be offered to strike or replace wasteful spending items in this bill. And I would call on my colleagues to consider these amendments with an open mind and a clear understanding of the dangerous consequences of a $1 trillion mistake. $1 trillion, Mr. President, is a terrible thing to waste. What we're talking about, as I mentioned, in terms of the dimensions of this, if you look at $100 bills side by side, 38.9 times it would go around the entire Earth at the equator. That's what we're talking about.